Hello everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of Character Code, a series where I examine characters ranging from movies, anime, video games, and everything in between. I'll be discussing their origins, goals, relationships, motivations, and everything that makes them a well-written character. In this episode, I'll be covering Miyamoto Musashi from the famous manga series Vagabond. He was highly requested by many of you, and I can definitely see why. He's a deeply existential character with a curse of insurmountable ambition. For the sake of this character, I'll be splitting this mini-series into 3 parts. The first part consisting of the first 100 chapters of his development. I'll be discussing the circumstances of his early life leading up until his adulthood, as well as the intricacies of his character and the growth he exhibits. So without further ado, let's begin. Miyamoto Musashi, born as Shinmen Takezo, was born in the late 16th century in the Sengoku era in Japan. It's important to note that this era in Japan was one of the most violent and unforgiving time periods in world history, filled with many feudal wars and social upheavals. A lot of Takezo's personality would be shaped because of the environment he was raised around and the people he was surrounded by. Takezo's father, Shinmen Munisai, was a famous samurai across the nation. When Takezo was young, his father divorced his mother and he was forced to learn martial arts. He longed to see his mother since she was gone, but his mother often rebuffed him, telling him to return to his father. Takezo started to inhabit loneliness because of this. This was also coupled with the intense fear he had for his father, who was a very harsh and strict man, often physically and verbally abusing him. Takezo tried to assassinate his father on multiple occasions, but always failed, only to be beaten by Munisai afterward. Takezo would later run into the bamboo forest to calm down. This led him to train himself with nature and garner a connection to it. During this time of growing into a young preteen, we will start to see 2 very important traits emerge: the spark of his ambition and his unquenchable bloodthirst. Takezo meets his childhood friends, Marahachi and Otsu. They notably have a profound impact on him in his youth, especially when it comes to the aforementioned traits I mentioned before. At the age of 13, Takezo saw a challenge posted by Kage Arima and accepted the duel. Kage Arima underestimated Takezo for his young age, and Takezo killed him with zero hesitation. In another instance, Ito Sai had traveled to a village to duel an unknown swordsman. Takezo would eventually hear of his stories and grow admiration from them. He even sculpts a demon statue in his honor and aspires to be like him. But this is just the beginning to Takezo's journey. This leads us to the very first chapter and arc of the story, when we are first introduced to Takezo. 4 years later, a brash, hot-headed, aggressive 17-year-old, he participates in the Battle of Sekigahara, one of the many civil wars that took place within the 1600s. Following the aftermath of the battle, Takezo narrowly survives and escapes, and because of this he's labeled a criminal, a man wanted by the refugee hunters. These hunters kill those who survived the war and fought for the losing side. Takezo doesn't have a choice but to fight these forces off, while taking refuge in nearby towns and small villages. During the manhunt, Takezo flees to his hometown Miyamoto, where the residents there refer to him as a demon child. He's seen as a vicious man capable of drawing fear and violence out of anybody. Because of this, the entire town fears him. This obviously doesn't make matters better, since the pursuit for him intensifies. It's apparent that through the past 4 years, Takezo has grown accustomed to the idea of all-out combat and was never afraid of killing, especially if it meant growing in strength. A great detail I noticed are his eyes. They carry a very distinct bestial gaze, which I think is a very great detail in contrast to the other characters in the story. Ever since he killed his first opponent at 13, his look and personality drastically changed. It became second nature for him to be violent and bloodthirsty. Every single pursuer that crossed Takezo's path was cut down effortlessly, but as the days went on, Takezo grew restless and exhausted. While his ambition to grow in strength was still intact, there would be a surge of discomfort with his actions, that perhaps this is the only life he would ever have, but he chooses to subdue these feelings toward his discomfort and closes his heart to the suffering of his enemies. During the ambush in Miyamoto, Takezo attempts to escape, but is greeted by a monk named Takuan. Takuan deeply examines Takezo, telling him that he is big, but he wields a small heart. It's here where we learn of Takezo's most notable trait in his early adolescence. It's a trait that shapes every decision he's made up until this point of his life, and that trait is fear. Takuan notices that Takezo is frightened of him, despite him wielding a weapon and putting up a front. He is constantly on the edge and is ready to lash out at those around him. During the point where Takezo is eventually captured, he's tied to a tree, awaiting death. But he begins to hallucinate and sees all the men he's killed. This is followed with the memories of his past, memories of his father, his mother, and his goal to become invincible under the sun. His memories, his ambition, and his bloodthirst for combat was the only thing Takezo had to cling on to. He didn't think about a life beyond this, or what would become of him. Takuan returns to save Takezo from an ambush, and he scares off the attacker with his sheer ki. He takes Takezo to a hideaway point, where he sits him down for a discussion, convincing him to change. Takezo becomes guilty from the harm and deaths he's caused, gaining a different perspective from Takuan, and he weeps, wondering if he even deserved to die because of his crimes. Takuan tells him there is no light for those who don't know darkness. Live on and endure the shadows. Takuan renames Takezo to Musashi Miyamoto to start a life anew. And there he goes, renamed after his hometown to carry on a new legacy of his life. The story time skips to when Musashi is 21 and arrives at the capital, Kyoto. Musashi still has his quest intact, to become invincible under the heavens. He intends to challenge the Yoshioka school, but his arrogance and confidence are still intact as well, and they certainly don't get him far. He arrives at the dojo only to challenge the students and master with only a wooden sword against their steel blades. He also demands a challenge with the head of the school, Seijiro Yoshioka, but he is denied. The members state that Musashi must fight the low-ranking members first, so that's what he does. He kills 5 of them. This displays his bloodthirst even more. He's still vicious at heart. Before Musashi prepares to fight a higher rank, Denshichiro, Seijiro intervenes and offers sake to him and asks Musashi to leave. Again, Musashi's arrogance and ambition is unwavering here, and he slashes the sake, staying in the dojo nonetheless. Right before leaving, Seijiro gives him a battle wound on his forehead and cuts down his stick, showing astute dominance over the blade. Musashi then turns to fight Denshichiro, and though he has much less skill than Denshichiro, they still fight to a standstill. Denshichiro has his left arm dislocated, while Musashi loses a lot of blood from his wounds. Denshichiro promises to fight Musashi again, and says that he will be a lot stronger. At this point, Musashi realizes that there is so much more to learn, and his training has to continue further. It's a real wake-up call for him. So he decides to travel to the Hozoin temple to fight against the monks there. In his quest, he has to overcome his fear and things that cloud his judgment. Throughout the story, there's a deeper underlying message that fighting isn't about just your strength and tactics, but how clearly you can see and how still your mind can become. We hear this through Takuan as they meet again. Preoccupied by a single leaf, and you won't see the tree. Preoccupied by a single tree, you'll miss the entire forest. Musashi is introduced to the monks of Hozoin, and it's here that he becomes a character that's much less cut and dry. He becomes more existential, someone that starts to become more aware of his nature. Not fully, but it's a start. He searches for the Grand Master Ine Hozoin to test his strength. On the way there, he meets a monk farmer who becomes a brief mentor to Musashi, giving him words of wisdom and short riddles to help him question his mind and morality. There's points where he scolds him as well, moving him to the point where he almost becomes aware of his bloodthirst. He asks Musashi what true strength is, a question that's been on Musashi's mind, and this one question plays a factor in Musashi's development throughout his endeavor with the monks. He arrives at the temple and meets Inshun, possibly the greatest young prodigy at the Hozoin temple, a cocky and skillful combatant who is respected by all of his peers. Musashi asks Inshun, if he defeats him, will he be the strongest? Inshun replies, telling him that yes, he would be considered strong. However, Musashi is completely outmatched by Inshun, not even able to land a single blow while taking hit after hit from Inshun's spear. His superior technique and stamina prove too much for Musashi, who relies on brute force. Musashi refused to concede when given the chance, and Inshun realized he would have to kill him. Facing death, Musashi ran away in fear. Later, when Musashi regains consciousness, he's in a house surrounded by the same monk farmer from before. It's here where the monk reveals himself as the legendary Grandmaster, Ine Hozoin. Musashi asks Ine to train him to defeat Inshun, which Ine agrees to. He takes him to the peaks to live out in the mountains to train. Each day, Ine would come out to check on Musashi's progress and duel him with a practice spear, in which Ine defeated him each time. Musashi would deal with his inner fear of Inshun through objects like trees and rocks, which would throw off his focus. Ine would then tell Musashi that he must truly see, and that he's only looking at everything in the world through a narrow point of view. His desires and fear and everything else that prevents you from fully seeing is why you lose. He must see everything in its entirety. These are the same words that echo through Takumon's mouth. Inshun back at the temple learns that Musashi is alive, and is invigorated to fight him again. He immediately writes a letter to Musashi, promising to meet him in the mountains for a rematch the next day. Musashi, now able to dodge Ine's attacks after his training, walks to the school at night to duel Inshun. While he stands in the rain, he begins to hallucinate his father, once again dealing with his inner consciousness and focus. Engulfed by fear, he walks back into the forest thinking of his childhood friends, Marahachi and Otsu. He admits that he's not ready to die. When it reaches dawn, Musashi sees Inshun sitting by the campfire waiting for him. At long last, Musashi and Inshun have their rematch, and this fight turns out to be a clash of spirits. Musashi, now calm and attentive, makes Inshun nervous, telling him that he can finally see. He sees through Inshun. He sees through his spear. He can see through everything in its entirety. Minutes pass before any of them can move. It gets intense, and both of them sweat profusely. Inshun sees Musashi way different from before. His spirit feels larger. Inshun strikes with his spear, but Musashi dodges it, only getting a scar on his right cheek. Once inside the spear's range, he counterattacks with his wooden sword and Inshun collapses. Musashi wins. In his celebration, Musashi briefly reverts back to his savage self, and continues to beat Inshun into the ground. He still shows signs of his inner demon, and the training he had wasn't enough to overcome it all. But once again, this was just a start. And with that, Musashi out of exhaustion collapses. In the arc's epilogue, Musashi and Inshun recover, forming something somewhat innocuous, a bond and friendship. Before parting ways, they vow to have another rematch, which won't be as life-threatening. Musashi begins to travel to the Yagyu estate to continue his perilous journey in overcoming his nature and becoming one with himself. But this is just the beginning. In the next episode, I'll be covering the Yagyu estate, as well as the next 100 chapters of his quest. Thanks for watching, and if you like Character Code, subscribe. If there are any other characters you would like to see covered, feel free to suggest them in the comments as well.